Well, good afternoon. For those of you that I have not met, and there are many familiar faces in here, we have these sessions often to talk about the very important issues and current affairs going on in Sri Lanka. I'm Congressman Bill Johnson, and I'm very grateful that you're here this afternoon as we continue to focus on transitional justice, constitutional change, and other reforms impacting civil society, as well as an update on the United States relations with Sri Lanka. Representative Danny Davis and I founded the Congressional Caucus on ethnic and religious freedom in Sri Lanka nearly 3 years ago. Since that time, Sri Lanka has seen monumental changes in their government, and with it, the opportunity to create vital reforms, restore democracy and civil and human rights for all Sri Lankans. And I know that we are all focused on this, so I know you all know already that while meaningful reforms demand time and careful consideration, it is crucial that the Sirisena government continues to move forward with their promised agenda. That's kind of the theme of what we have been focused on for the last, ever since the Sirisena government came into power. The hope and enthusiasm for the promises of change from a newly elected government must not be allowed to dwindle due to a lack of progress. We're fortunate to have a distinguished panel today that will provide us with an update on transitional justice, steps taken by the Sirisena government to implement their agenda, and how these reforms are impacting society. When Representative Davis gets here, then we'll get started. But right now, let me introduce our distinguished panel today, and we'll let then Representative Davis step in to give his remarks when he gets here. First, we'll hear from Dr. Kate Cronin-Furman, who is spending the academic year as a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Beller. Have I got that right? Am I pronouncing that?
Belfer Center.
Belfer. Oh, I need to put my glasses on. Sorry. Belfer. Looked like an L. Belfer Center for Space and International Affairs, for Science and International Affairs. I'm going to say that all over again because I messed it up so bad. The Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. You're going to put that in your signature block somewhere? You better find an acronym for that. Thank you for coming to Washington today, Dr. Cronin-Furman, and to participate in our briefing. Both a lawyer and a political scientist, Dr. Cronin-Furman has practiced law in New York, Cambodia, and The Hague. She has also conducted field work in Sri Lanka, and her research has examined when and how justice is delivered for atrocity crimes. Next, we'll hear from Mona Dave, who is an Asia Program Officer at the National Endowment for Democracy. Ms. Dave is responsible for monitoring and evaluating endowment grants to civil society organizations in South Asia, including Sri Lanka. Prior to joining the endowment, she served as a government relations advocacy associate at Amnesty International USA, where she engaged in efforts to advance legislation and policies on universal basic education and the rights of ethnic minorities. And finally, we'll then hear from Kara Bew, who is a founding partner at Armitage International, a consulting firm that specializes in international business development, strategic planning, and problem solving. Before joining Armitage International, Ms. Bew served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Regional Stability within the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, and also as a Special Assistant for South Asia to then Deputy Secretary of State Richard L. Armitage. Ladies, thank you for being here with us today. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you. So now, Dr. Kate Cronin-Furman, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm I'm going to talk a little bit about transitional justice in comparative perspective, and about how we should view the progress that's been undertaken in Sri Lanka over the last 18 or 20 months. And let me kind of preface that by saying what I'm basing this on. So I'm a human rights lawyer and political scientist, and at the moment I am completing a book that basically looks at what happened after 90 mass atrocities that have occurred over the last 45 years. I look at the politics of transitional justice and the conditions under which it's likely to be successful. I've also been to Sri Lanka 5 times over the last 3 years, researching the politics of transitional justice there, in addition to fieldwork in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, and Cambodia. So what I've learned from this research is that robust transitional justice, and by that I mean criminal trials of those who are the most responsible for the most serious international crimes, only happens under very specific circumstances. So first things first, it is simply the case that the perpetrators of mass atrocities do not prosecute themselves ever. Without real regime change, you simply do not see transitional justice. And second, because accountability processes can be extremely expensive and time-consuming, they almost never happen without strong and coordinated domestic demand. And this is a particular stumbling block in democracies, actually, although that seems kind of paradoxical. And that's because governments can be punished at the polls for pushing accountability against the preferences of an electoral majority. So we're here today to talk about Sri Lanka. And what those things tell us about Sri Lanka is that it is exactly the kind of context in which transitional justice is unfortunately going to be very, very challenging. It is the case that in Sri Lanka, a number of accused perpetrators do remain in positions of power, both within the civilian government and the military hierarchy. Added to that, the majority Sinhala Buddhist population, which does make up the core of the ruling government's constituency, is deeply opposed to the accountability process. So we saw recently that the passage of the Office of Missing Persons legislation, which is by far the least threatening piece of the transitional justice program, was actually extremely contentious. Now, I make no judgment here about the sincerity of the Sri Lankan government's commitment to a transitional justice process. Obviously, the country's politics have undergone enormous change over the last year and a half or so, and this has been accompanied by clear signals of a desire to live up to their international obligations. So this is a huge improvement, from the perspective of U.S.-Sri Lanka relations and Sri Lanka's role in the world. And we have seen real movement on the issue of acknowledging war crimes. So for instance, the foreign minister explicitly admitted that the Channel 4 footage is real, which is a huge change from the prior administration. But it's still very hard to get around the fact that this is a democracy with a large electoral majority that flatly contests that atrocities occurred and believes any investigation would be tantamount to a witch hunt against their war heroes. We've seen members of the ousted Rajapaksa regime are exploiting these sentiments in an attempt to position themselves to return to power. And if we add to that the fact that the government has actually repeatedly emphasized to the members of the international community that the civilian administration does not have full control over the military and is concerned about alienating or threatening them, you can see that in fact pursuing transitional justice is extremely risky for this government. So those are the structural conditions that any expectations about progress on transitional justice need to contend with. There's actually an additional challenge here that I'd like to focus on with the remainder of my time, and that is actually that many in the victim community are now losing faith in this process. So when we talk about transitional justice, the word transition in that phrase either means a regime transition or a transition from war to peace. And when you are in Colombo, there's a very clear sense that both of these things have happened. Tremendous political change and kind of a tremendous change to the atmosphere from the days when the war was ongoing to now. But when you're in the Northeast, it's easy to feel that in fact neither of these changes has occurred. So I just spent a few weeks in July and August speaking with the war-affected population in the Northeast, and was very struck by how present this conflict continues to feel for so many people. Now, part of that is simply because of the continued presence of the military in the Northeast. And I personally observed the very oppressive presence of the security sector. I myself was videotaped, photographed by members of the security services. And kind of the upshot of that is that, people told us that it was only now that they felt comfortable reporting human rights abuses that had happened to them in 2009 or earlier. So these things still feel very present, very current to people. Additionally, there was very little faith that the changes that had occurred over the last 18 months was real. So somebody said to me, you're here because Saracena is in, but that might change tomorrow. And the implication there was that, all of the members of the international community coming in would be out in a heartbeat if the regime switched back. Now, this is quite complicated because, in fact, victims, of course, don't want to lose hope about justice. They want to believe that change is coming, that someday they will find out what happened to their loved ones, that they will see the culture of impunity ended. But the result is that they are now placing all of their faith in the international community. So, I heard very low expectations about the possibility that the Office of Missing Persons would kind of deliver them anything that would help. People repeatedly said what makes it different from the previous institutions. They complained about the lack of victim consultations, which I'm sure Mona will address in a moment. And they had no faith in the ability of any sort of domestic judicial mechanism to deliver justice. So what I heard again and again was that the presence of foreign judges on any prosecutorial mechanism was an absolute minimum precondition for people to feel comfortable participating and for them to believe that there would be any progress. Just to conclude here, the fact that this is kind of a deeply traumatized population that is regularly re-traumatized by the continuing presence of the security sector, by the fact that there's minimal availability of psychosocial services, by the amount of violence that they have seen and experienced and continue to experience, means that there's kind of very little leeway for this process to go wrong. These people are kind of on their last hope, very much, continuing to have faith that the international community can deliver them something that will help, but really, really in tough shape and really not trusting that domestic processes can do the trick. So, from the perspective of the international community, which has become very focused on kind of trying to welcome progress, of course, trying to encourage continued change, I think it is absolutely fundamental that we focus on changing the structural conditions that I outlined earlier, on kind of reaching out to the Sinhala Buddhist South in order to kind of bring them along for the ride, because, if they are not convinced of the need for transitional justice, it is very unlikely that it will succeed. And the other main kind of pillar here is, of course, going to have to be security sector reform, because with the continued presence of perpetrators in power, once again, transitional justice is absolutely impossible. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mona?
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Caucus for this opportunity to present today on the developments that are taking place in Sri Lanka, and to thank Representatives Johnson and Davis for their leadership and the leadership that they have shown in ensuring that human rights and democracy are a critical aspect of the U.S. relationship with Sri Lanka. Also, I know for those congressional staff, this is a busy week, so we appreciate that you're here to join us for this discussion. Given the other two discussions today, I would like to focus my remarks on the role of civil society and the experience of victims of rights violations in the transitional justice process. In particular, I would like to focus on the victims of disappearances who are well organized and vocal in their demands for truth and justice. This is in part because of the country having a staggeringly high number of enforced disappearances from nearly 3 decades of ethnic conflict and 2 Marxist insurrections. The government has stated that about 65,000 people are disappeared, while advocates would argue that this number is higher. This disparity actually exemplifies why there is a need for a proper accounting of those cases. I recognize that there are a lot of other issues that are pressing in the current political environment and hope that we can get into those in the Q&A. Since coming to power over about 1 year ago, the Sirisena Wickremesinghe National Unity Government has moved to roll back some of the anti-democratic laws and policies of the Rajapaksa era, and has sought to introduce measures to strengthen the democratic disposition. This includes amending the Constitution to strengthen democratic checks and balances, passing the Right to Information Act, and tackling constitutional reform and transitional justice. When the government of Sri Lanka signed the resolution for the promotion of reconciliation, accountability, and human rights at the UN Human Rights Council in September 2015, it recognized that truth and justice are central to the establishment of a stable political order. While truth is an indispensable aspect of reconciliation, the country cannot move forward without simultaneously addressing impunity, accountability, and justice for crimes committed. And Kate has touched on some of those points as well. In July, a government-appointed task force led by members of civil society began consultations to ascertain the views of the public as well as their aspirations about various reconciliation mechanisms. The government established a similar but separate body of academics, lawyers, and others that are focused on constitutional reform. Such consultations are really a critical aspect of building trust and ensuring the credibility of these institutions that will be established in order to advance this reform. But the process by which these consultations are held and the meaningful consideration as well as integration of those points into the actual mechanisms that are created is what's really fundamental. It's on this last point that I would like to stress a bit that there is serious concern amongst Sri Lankan civil society and victims groups. In a nutshell, the steps that the government followed in fast-tracking the establishment of this Office on Missing Persons undermine the framework that the government itself had set out for in terms of the transitional justice process. The official task force on consultations itself even noted that key recommendations of the affected communities on the title, composition, and powers of the office are not included in the bill. While the government integrated some amendments offered by various political parties in Parliament, the lack of consultation and communication when designing this first of 4 reconciliation mechanisms raises questions about the political will and the process going forward. Furthermore, the consultations, which wrapped up this month, moved forward with limited public education about the mechanisms which people were being asked to comment on. They also saw mixed participation because of a lack of outreach and encouragement of the public to join those meetings. Finally, they, possibly because of a lack of resources, faced a basic mismanagement in terms of logistical needs. So translations were missing in places of the North and East where the members of the task force would be able to actually interface with the victims themselves. Since the 90s, Sri Lanka has convened numerous commissions to address disappearances and other human rights violations, but they failed to provide answers as well as justice. And the government should really work to ensure that this current effort builds upon the lessons learned and delivers on the promises that it has put out. Intimidation and threats are also continuing in terms of those that are raising ongoing human rights violations. Security personnel continue to visit public gatherings and civil society offices. There were consistent reports that during the consultations process, there was presence of the military, as well as during meetings of civil society to raise awareness amongst their networks about that same process. So even just in civic education programming. While there have been improvements, as others have stated, a climate of fear does persist. And this is particularly in the North and East, and particularly amongst select victim groups. So certain issues are not being raised during these meetings because people have fear based on the type of violation that they have suffered. The creation of a conducive environment for free expression and association is essential, not only for a successful transitional justice process, but most importantly for a sustainable democratic future. Despite these shortcomings, many in civil society are eager as well as qualified to contribute towards making this process successful and deliver on its promises. This is illustrated by the large number of civil society actors who are on the consultations task force as well as its associated bodies. This is also reflected in the diversity of expectations and experiences and needs presented by the victims as well as civil society during these consultations. This plurality of voices is really quite key and an essential aspect of the process moving forward. Those that are providing critique that is productive should not be labeled as spoilers. As Kate said, individuals do lack trust in this process and are concerned about whether a domestic process can deliver for them. But they are still coming, they are still showing up and giving their critiques in a very concerted fashion. And we've seen that from the many marches, protests, as well as statements put out by various members of civil society. So including these different voices into the debate will actually broaden participation as well as build confidence that the deliberative nature of the process is a true one. As Sri Lanka is in this initial phase of implementing transitional justice, they will still have to develop a truth and reconciliation body, a special court, a reparations mechanism, and it is now a really great opportunity for them to improve upon past efforts in terms of their messaging, the process, and inclusion to ensure that public ownership and confidence in these institutions is real. I'd like to just make a couple of recommendations as it relates to the transitional justice process and civil society's role. Upon enactment and establishment of the reconciliation mechanisms, the process for technical, legal, and policy development will have to be rooted in public debate and discussion for it to be successful. The challenge of implementation requires a long-term commitment, and it is important for us all in the U.S. as well as in Sri Lanka and other supporters of this government to think beyond March, which is when the Human Rights Council will hear updates on progress towards implementing last year's resolution. It's also important for the international community to engage with and support Sri Lanka as it advances transitional justice and builds trust as well as restores rights. This can take the form of an updated Human Rights Council consensus mandate, as well as, which many members of civil society are calling for, the establishment of an in-country Human Rights Commission office that provides capacity and technical assistance. Secondly, in recognizing that the government must balance these very many competing interests in this highly polarized environment, it's also important that it launches a public information campaign that articulates a national vision for the future. Leadership at the highest levels needs to deliver a consistent public message, both abroad as well as at home, that expresses its commitment to the transitional justice process and other democratic reforms. The debate that took place within the Parliament was a very contentious one on the Office of Missing Persons. The joint opposition was prepared to create a bit of a disturbance in that particular moment. And I think we have to recognize that that is also what happens within Parliament and is reflective within the broader Sinhalese majority. That said, the various groups that the NED works with and a number of people in the Sinhalese civil society really do have a desire to talk about these issues. It's really imperative that both civil society as well as the government create that space for that discussion to happen in an honest and true fashion. So I don't think we should, I do think that the joint opposition is a reflection of the mood, but I think there is an opportunity to really get to those individuals that are willing to have an honest discussion. Lastly, I think it's also quite important that the government invest in a public education campaign on these issues, both basic democratic reform issues, as well as those related to the transitional justice process. This is what will allow for the debate to reach all corners of society and create support for either a referendum when it comes to the Constitution or for final mechanisms of the transitional justice process. Lastly, as I mentioned, a conducive environment for democratic reform and reconciliation is quite essential. Being able to address the immediate needs and concerns of citizens that were most affected by the war are also quite important. Trust-building measures, some of which were included inside of the Human Rights Council resolution, include things like the release of prisoners held under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, as well as the repeal of that act, demilitarization and the release of land in the north and east, as well as in some other parts of the country, and the cessation of ongoing violations, including intimidation and surveillance. I would like to thank you all for your continued attention on this issue and for your interest in the human rights and democratic situation of Sri Lanka.
I too would like to thank Representatives Johnson and Davis for their work on the caucus and the important role the caucus plays on keeping people's eyes and ears open to the issues that are so important in Sri Lanka today. I was asked to speak generally on U.S.-Sri Lanka relations, both currently and in the future, and then maybe touch a little bit on security sector reform. In talking with diplomats on both sides, I've gotten a resounding excitement about how good the relations are. I could sit at home alone and think of all the reasons why they shouldn't be so excellent as they are called, but there is a definite enthusiasm on both sides to have better relationships between the two nations. From the U.S. perspective, the new government offered a lot of opportunity to really switch how the U.S. engaged with Sri Lanka, not only on the humanitarian side of how we could engage, but on a much broader range of engagement opportunities. So the U.S. is looking not just at the very important areas of reconciliation, accountability, transitional justice efforts, but also to look at security, economy, trade. And so from their perspective, relations with Sri Lanka, all of a sudden the aperture opened up for the United States, and they're working hard to take advantage of that. In particular, when I talk to people in the administration, obviously the human rights aspects are paramount, but there is a key interest in the economy of Sri Lanka and the ability to grow that economy such that it could sustain a peace. Because in the end, too, there's a strong belief that if economy can't support its people, important things don't happen. Security becomes more of an issue. Security sector reform becomes more of a problem. If you can't grow the economy and create jobs and improve education, then other things don't happen. And so that's something that I know on the U.S. side that they're focused intently on. A lot of work is being done, for example, on trying to improve foreign direct investment in the country. working with the Sri Lankan government in order to remove a lot of the self-imposed red tape and difficulties in doing business in country. Also, they're looking at the Millennium Challenge Corporation and how best it could serve Sri Lanka. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, has been very helpful in bringing countries coming out of post-conflict experiences or out of poverty and helping them get a foot in the door in terms of building a better economy in order to support a more stable democracy. And so hopefully in December, when the board next meets, that they might be able to get Sri Lanka into a full compact with the Millennium Challenge account. And so those things I think are very exciting and is meant not to replace any of the enthusiasm on the other side, but something I think that will underpin the good work being done in other areas. From the State Department perspective, all of this expanded opportunity has encouraged them to start building out their team in Sri Lanka, and they're adding people both on USAID and on the state side, and I think that's a very good indication for the long-term commitment that we're making to this relationship. The issue, however, for the United States and Sri Lanka is that we all know that while things are moving in the right direction, they're moving very slowly, and the situation politically remains still very fragile. So I think the mantra for everyone, and it's going to be a challenge for both Sri Lanka and the U.S., is to stay the course. And that brings me to the future of Sri Lanka, U.S.-Sri Lanka relations. In 2015, it was very exciting to see what happened when the Sri Lankan public came to the polls, and that energized everybody. We are going to have an election coming up, and it's going to be a question of what happens with the new administration. We've had the benefit in this administration recently, since 2015, not only of this shiny new election that happened and all of the possibility it offered, but we also had a number of people in the administration who had a personal interest in Sri Lanka, in humanitarian issues related to Sri Lanka, and that helped move U.S.-Sri Lanka relations along. That doesn't get tossed out the window in a new administration, but it's going to be a different dynamic. We're 2 years on from the elections in 2015. The excitement could be dimmed a little bit because we'll be well into the slog of really hard challenges, trying to bring Sri Lanka along on transitional justice, trying to improve the economy, trying to move forward on confidence-building efforts on reconciliation. So it will be hard work and less exciting because it will have been 2 years. And if you judge what other experts say on bringing countries out of post-conflict experiences, it's usually decades. So we're in the middle of a hard slog. We'll also have a new administration whose priorities may be entirely different. Sri Lanka, while it's on a to-do list, it's never really high on the to-do list. And with the new administration coming in, it's going to take some concerted effort on all of our parts to make sure that those issues don't get drowned out by some of the larger issues of a new president. And then finally, and this is the beauty of this caucus and all of you who take an interest in Sri Lanka, is you have a ready group that can help supplant a personal interest perhaps on some of the new administration coming in. Because having served in administration, I think those personal interests really do make a difference in how hard you push on something that isn't automatically directed upon you from on high. So I just make a plea for U.S.-Sri Lanka relations in the future that you all know what an important role the caucus plays and that you all play as you advocate for change and progress in Sri Lanka. Just very briefly on security sector reform, and I don't want to take up much more time because I know you all have questions for all of us. Security sector reform is a very broad category. Just focusing on the military, everyone knows what needs to happen. It needs to go from a war-type footing to a peacetime footing, and there needs to be more civilian control over the military, more authority asserted over the military. Those are all easy things to say, but it's so very complicated, both politically within Sri Lanka, culturally, socially within Sri Lanka, given the role the military has played, in particular in the south. So it's very complex. The military has made certain changes in the north. They've retracted to their cantonments. There are tons of military facilities that remain and tons of people in them. They may be less visible, but that too is an improvement. Their overt interference and surveillance has been reduced, but it's not gone, obviously. And they've conducted some land release. Obviously, again, not to the extent that the population in the north and east would like, but these are at least movements towards some progress. They're also looking at finding other things for the military to do that make sense for a peacetime military. They're focusing on possible efforts in UN peacekeeping. They're shifting their focus away from war fighting to more of a maritime governance role among their security forces and how best to coordinate that and build out a Coast Guard. They're looking into increasing their capacity in humanitarian and disaster relief, even cyber they're looking into. But as you know, there is a lot left that would need to happen. I really don't have a lot of hope that anything significant is going to happen very soon. My sense is that the government is a bit bogged down with more of the political aspects of what it's dealing with and how best it can follow through on the commitments it's made internationally, particularly in Geneva. So I think we're years off for a really significant and comprehensive security sector reform initiative. That said, I think it's worthwhile to continue pressing the Sri Lankan government on this front. They really need to have a very politically and socially savvy plan for getting this done. And I think that's where the U.S., going back to U.S.-Sri Lanka relations, I think that's where we could be very helpful, understanding that it's not going to happen soon. Just today I saw on the news that gave me just a little glimmer of hope that at least it's still on the agenda for the Sri Lankans is the President Sirisena. Essentially, he didn't sack, but he didn't extend the term of his air marshal. And there were several reasons for it, but a lot of people believe because he was feeling the air marshal was getting a little out ahead of the government. And so if there's any hope that they recognize civilian control over the military, that was one good sign. But again, it will take time. But I'm hopeful the U.S. in particular can be very helpful as they move forward. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's open it up for questions. Anybody? Yes, sir. Would you stand, please, so everyone can hear? Thank you.
Hi, James Sarlin, Blue American Foundation. Sorry I missed the first 10 minutes, but Foreign Minister Samir, Foreign Minister and the Speaker of the Parliament are here this week. And in fact, I wish this briefing were yesterday, so I'd have something to talk about with them yesterday. And the ambassador was inviting them, and the lead of DC and the State Department were there. Have you met with them, or do you plan on meeting them? And if you do meet with them, what would you say to them, or how can we further this conversation so that such meetings are more?
I don't believe we have a plan to meet with the foreign minister. We have met with the ambassador.
The Speaker of the Parliament is also.
Yes, and you might remember they made presentations here some time ago, but no, I wasn't even aware that the foreign minister was in town, so no, there are no plans to meet with him while we're here.
From what I understand, that he's here for an oceans conference of the State Department, and I don't know if anything would be put on the agenda there that would be of value.
On such short notice, I'm not certain, but we'll certainly look into that. Anybody else have a question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if progress slows to a snail's pace, what recourse does the U.S. have? What do you think the U.S. will do? What possibilities for action are there? I mean, of course, if they start moving faster, we can go and keep encouraging and so on. Though, I mean, we have a lot of money involved here, we have a lot of prestige, we have a lot of interest. What do we do if progress really doesn't go forward or is not satisfactory or doesn't meet expectations or something like that?
I can't speak for our government anymore, but I think we do have some leverage.
Let's turn your mic off. I think people can hear you. I'm not sure why it's feeding back. Our sound guy is gone, so.
Yeah, I think we do have some leverage. Really, we don't have a lot of money that's going into Sri Lanka. It's been pretty pitiful compared to how it was back in 2002 and 2003 when we were really engaged. We are really engaged now, but we have not encouraged the international community to pony up a lot in Sri Lanka. So it is the U.S. prestige. And so I think the U.S., to the extent that Sri Lanka isn't moving forward on its commitments in Geneva, for example, it can start being more vocal, less backslapping, encouraging allies and partners to start backing away from its support of the government. I think, but there isn't a whole lot of leverage other than that.
Well, I was going to follow that up. Do you think there's a cause and effect here? Do you think the fact that the U.S. has backed off in support is related to the lack of progress? Do you think there's any of that?
I don't. I've in speaking with some in the Sri Lankan government, I know there's some disappointment in certain quarters that the U.S. hasn't, for example, organized a donors conference as it assisted with in Tokyo in 2003. There's a lot of disappointment there. But I think there are so many other challenges facing the government at this point that that's really not a factor in the slow going.
Okay.
To add to that, before we get to whether what the leverage will look like when it comes to, or if it comes to a screeching halt, I think to your point, there are opportunities and there is some leverage to be had. USAID's involvement there and hearing of this increase is really great. The re-entry of other donors, I think, is also quite key. Members of the task force have been vocal, and others in civil society, that if these mechanisms are going to work, they need to be well funded. And that is a role that a variety of different bilateral donors in particular can play, whether it's through a concerted effort like the Tokyo conference or other ways of engaging. I would also say that, yes, a new administration, there may be a new lens that Sri Lanka is seen through, but I think we can't forget the political capital that our government has put out there in the international community when it supported throughout the years from 2010 up until this last resolution to ensure that we were both supportive of the Sri Lankan government in initially the LLRC, the Lessons Learned and Reconciliations Committee, to finally the point where there was the setting up of the Office of Inquiry into the human rights violations in Sri Lanka. So there's a lot of political capital that our government put out there, and I think it's really incumbent upon all of us that are close watchers to encourage them to follow through on that in particular, because I don't think it's just about Sri Lanka. It is about war crimes all around the world.
I agree with the last part of your statement there, particularly that it's incumbent upon all of us to keep the pressure on to make sure that we get the rate of return that we're expecting on that political capital. I have to tell you, though, this is not the only example, in my observation, of a lack of appreciation of what political capital really counts for by this administration and the State Department. This is not the only failure of not taking advantage of our political capital around the world. And so I agree with you. It's incumbent upon us to keep the pressure on. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, if I could just add, I think dealing with incomplete human rights progress is one of the most challenging issue areas, for kind of this sector of diplomacy, right? It's very easy to know what to do with a rogue state because you just say, stop doing that and issue threats and so on. But I think, I don't think it's unique to this administration, but I think we have seen several times with this administration some difficulty assessing how to proceed in these situations where there is movement, but maybe it's not fast enough or complete enough. And Sri Lanka, to me, is kind of a classic example of that sort of a scenario. Added to that, of course, is the fact that, we maybe lack some of the more aggressive forms of leverage that we have in other contexts, and definitely, I've heard again and again from U.S. sources that there's concern about the relationship of Sri Lanka with China, and that if we are too assertive, and I say we, but I have absolutely no connection to the U.S. government, if the U.S. is too assertive, then perhaps Sri Lanka turns back towards China. But I would emphasize that this is a government, the new-ish Sri Lankan regime is a government that is phenomenally sensitive to its international reputation. And I think that there will always be opportunities to leverage that and to kind of use the fact that they are very interested in being a full-fledged member of the international community in good standing to continue to push for progress.
Do you think, because it's my understanding that China is also interested in exerting their influence there. Do either of you have any sense of how the Sirisena government views that relationship?
My understanding, given some things the Prime Minister has written of late, and I think this government didn't make a shift from China to the West. They're going to straddle it. They're going to use China or accept China's support economically because they need it. And so China's not going to go away. This isn't a West versus China. They're going to sit on a stool with three legs, and it's going to be the West, China, and India. That's how I think they're.
And I think that when this government came into power, the Colombo Port project was one that was highly contested. There were questions about whether or not that would proceed. That's a deal that's being done with China, and as we have seen, that project will continue as planned. There have been some tweaks, but that will continue. And the Prime Minister just recently went to China and was focused, as I understand, primarily on questions of special economic zones. So I would agree completely that that relationship will continue to be a robust one.
I'll follow on then, and sir, then I'll come to you. Assuming you are correct, and I think you are, China, India, and the United States, if those three countries were to come together mutually to develop or at least to stand firm on the expectations of the international community, that would certainly weigh heavier than any one country alone. Do you know if there's any engagement at the State Department to try and take that avenue?
I know that we work closely with the Indian government on Sri Lanka matters, and I think we're very like-minded in that regard. But I think China's foreign policy is such that they don't want any internal role in a country. I mean, I think given how all they want is to have their own influence, but they let countries, as a matter of fact, do what they want domestically. And so I think it would be unique for China to kind of exert influence as to how Sri Lanka deals with its post-conflict issues.
And I guess the only reason I was asking that, we're seeing China at least make some overt moves to try and stymie the North Korean incident. They are making some comments publicly.
Right.
Their government is. So I didn't know if you saw an opportunity there or not.
If I could just comment on the
Sure.
India piece of it. India was instrumental in the 2014 process of bringing Sri Lanka forward onto the international stage. But I think that in light of this change in government, as well as a stated commitment to see the transitional justice process forward, India has not been quite as vocal there because, yes, again, there is a competition in terms of the competing economic interests. If we also look at India's engagement with its other neighbors as it pertains to human rights questions, let's say, for example, Bangladesh, I don't think we can expect them to be at the forefront of human rights questions in Sri Lanka, particularly with this change in government and someone they can work with.
Okay, all right. Sir? And this will be the final question. We're about run out of time.
Congressional Research Service. I'm interested in your views on how the domestic political context influences constitutional political reform and transitional justice in Sri Lanka.
I can take it. Okay. Well, let's see. So as you know, the PRC, the People's Representation Committee, I can't think of or Public Representations Committee, went out, I mentioned it, went out and did a variety of consultations with civil society and has come out with a pretty great 500-plus page report of various different aspirations that people have, including on a lot of the very contentious issues that are at the fore. I think that this government and its allies do want to see constitutional reform happen very soon, and there has been talk that there can be a good draft in October, if not in the early new year, because November will be occupied by the budget debate. And so at that point, it will go for a referendum in the new year, as we all know. But I think that what's happening now is that despite this PRC report being out there and the various considerations being out there, a lot of the drafting is happening in a closed door kind of fashion, which is to be expected. And the political parties are really hashing out what they are and aren't willing to compromise. And I think the big issues are going to be questions of the merger of the Northeast, questions of the devolution of power, because in particular the two sticking issues will be policing and land. And of course land is related to questions of the military. And then I'm trying to think of what the third issues, but those are the two big ones. And I would say the symbolic questions of Buddhism having the foremost place in the nation are ones that are being hashed out. And I think that the big question that we all need to be looking at is how they are negotiating that and the trust that is being built between the different political parties as they go about that process. Because I think that will really be what does and doesn't break it, and what ultimately does and doesn't allow a referendum to successfully pass. And just a final point, I would say this goes back to my final, or one of my points about there needing to be a good public education campaign and good outreach so that people have a sense of what it is that is in these documents as they go to the polls, because there is a lot of misinformation, particularly from members of the former regime.
Well, thank you to each of our panelists today. Very, very important update and a look at current relations between the U.S. and Sri Lanka. As the caucus chair, I can assure you that we will continue this work. It is painstaking and time-consuming work because, as you said, there are no immediate we're not going to get a solution quickly. They are in the middle of a transitional government that hasn't quite settled down and gotten its politics under control. We're about to go through a major shift in our political spectrum here. But we all know that the restoration of democracy and civil and human rights is long overdue, and that the U.S. plays an important role in that. You mentioned the political capital that's already been expended, and that's something that has to be considered. And I certainly hope that the next administration, whoever that is, continues to exert U.S. influence to make sure that the Sirisena government follows through with the reconciliation agenda that it put out, because the world is waiting to see that that happens. And quite honestly, the people who live there need that to happen desperately. Okay, well, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
And thanks, everybody.
Other countries do this.
I handle Nepal, Bangladesh. We have a colleague that handles just Pakistan.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. You bet.
Thank you very much. Yes, and then we don't have programming in India, but